The carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when Nora Bell heard the shattering of glass from the dining hall, followed by a voice sharp enough to cut through stone. She had been carrying a tray of polished silverware toward the long table, her hands steady from years of practice, when her foot caught the edge of a rug that had been moved without her knowledge. A single glass of red wine tipped and fell, spreading across the white tablecloth like a wound opening in fresh snow. Before she could even reach for a cloth to stop the spread, a hand gripped her wrist so hard she gasped. "Do you have any idea what that tablecloth cost?" Constance Whitmore's voice rang out across the hall, loud enough that 3 guests near the entrance turned their heads. "Do you people ever think before you move?" Nora tried to pull her hand back gently, her heart pounding, her face burning with humiliation in front of strangers. "I'm very sorry, miss. I'll clean it right away." "You'll do more than clean it," Constance snapped, releasing her wrist only to jab a finger toward her face. "You'll pay for it out of whatever pitiful wage they give you here. Honestly, I don't know why this house keeps staff who can't even carry a tray without breaking something." The hall had gone quiet except for the low murmur of guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. Nora lowered her eyes, the sting of tears building behind them, though she refused to let them fall in front of so many people. She had worked at Ashworth Manor for 6 years. She had scrubbed its floors during the coldest winters, nursed the previous housekeeper through illness, and never once had anyone spoken to her with such open cruelty. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but no words came. Shame had closed her throat entirely. What none of them noticed was the man standing near the side entrance, still wearing his traveling coat, dust from the road still clinging to his boots. Julian Ashworth had arrived 2 hours earlier than expected, choosing to enter through the servants' passage so he could surprise the household with his early return. Instead, he found himself standing frozen in the shadow of a stone archway, watching a scene he never could have imagined unfolding in his own home. He recognized Nora immediately. She had been part of the household staff since before he left for his business ventures overseas, a quiet young woman who never sought attention, who did her work with a steadiness that the older staff often praised in his presence. He remembered his mother once saying that Nora had more grace in her smallest gesture than most women had in an entire ballroom. And now here she was, trembling, her wrist still red from where it had been gripped, while a woman he barely knew tore into her in front of half the guests invited to celebrate his homecoming. The woman doing the shouting was Constance Whitmore, his intended bride. Julian had agreed to the match nearly a year ago, arranged through family connections and mutual business interests, sealed through letters exchanged across an ocean while he managed his father's shipping ventures abroad. He had met her only twice before leaving, both times in formal settings where she had been polished, charming, and careful with her words. He had told himself that a marriage built on practical foundations could still grow into something real, that affection could follow arrangement if both people were willing. Watching her now, he wondered if he had ever truly seen her at all. He did not move at first. Some part of him needed to understand the full shape of what was happening before he stepped into it. He watched as Constance turned to a nearby guest, laughing lightly as though she had merely swatted away an insect, rather than humiliated a person in front of a room full of strangers. He watched as Nora knelt to gather the pieces of a shattered glass, her hands shaking, refusing to look up at anyone around her. He watched the other staff exchange glances, none of them daring to intervene, each of them clearly used to swallowing their own dignity to keep their positions secure. A slow, cold understanding settled into his chest. This was not a single outburst born of stress or fatigue. This was a pattern. He could see it in the way the staff avoided Constance's gaze, in the way even the guests seemed unsurprised by her tone, as though they had already witnessed similar scenes since her arrival at the manor days earlier. Julian's jaw tightened. He thought of his mother, who had always insisted that the true measure of a person was not how they treated equals, but how they treated those who depended on them. He thought of his father, who had built an entire fortune while never once raising his voice at a servant, who used to say that cruelty toward the powerless was the surest sign of a weak character hiding behind wealth. He stepped forward. The moment he crossed into the light of the hall, a ripple passed through the room. A guest near the door gasped his name. Heads turned. Constance froze mid-sentence, her hand still raised in a gesture of scolding, her mouth still open with words that died the instant she saw him standing there. "Julian," she said, her voice shifting instantly from sharp to sweet, the transformation so fast it was almost impressive. "You're early. I wasn't expecting you until this evening. I would have arranged everything so much more perfectly if I had known." He did not answer her right away. His eyes moved past her, toward Nora, who was still kneeling on the floor, glass fragments cradled carefully in a cloth in her hands, her eyes fixed on the ground as though she wished it would simply swallow her whole. "Nora," Julian said gently, his voice carrying none of the coldness he felt toward the woman standing beside her. "Are you hurt?" The question seemed to catch everyone off guard, including Nora herself. She looked up slowly, as though unsure whether the question had truly been directed at her. "No, sir. I'm only sorry about the tablecloth. I'll have it replaced before evening." "You'll do no such thing," Julian said, and something in his tone made the entire room go still. He crossed the hall and knelt beside her, taking the cloth of broken glass gently from her hands and setting it aside, careful of the sharp edges. "You are not responsible for an accident. Accidents happen in every household in the world, including this one, long before you arrived and long after you leave, should you ever choose to." He helped her to her feet, his hand steady beneath her elbow, and for the first time since the shouting began, Nora allowed herself to breathe fully. Constance's smile had begun to falter at the edges, though she tried valiantly to hold it in place. "Julian, darling, I was simply trying to maintain some standards in the household before your guests arrived. You know how important first impressions are." "First impressions," Julian repeated slowly, turning to face her fully now, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made several guests shift uncomfortably where they stood. "Yes, I agree entirely. And the impression I have just witnessed will stay with me for a very long time." Color rose in Constance's cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or anger it was difficult to say. "I don't understand what you mean." "I think you understand perfectly," Julian said. "You gripped this young woman's wrist hard enough to leave a mark. You shouted at her in front of guests over a glass of spilled wine. You demanded she pay for a tablecloth from wages that likely wouldn't cover a fraction of its cost. And you did all of this in a house that is not yet even yours to command." A murmur passed through the gathered guests, some looking scandalized, others looking as though they had simply been waiting for someone to say aloud what they had already suspected about the woman who would soon be mistress of Ashworth Manor. Constance's composure cracked further. "Julian, please, we shouldn't discuss this in front of everyone. Let's speak privately." "We will speak privately," Julian said evenly. "But first, I want to make something clear to every person standing in this hall, staff and guest alike." He turned, addressing the room now, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had spent years commanding respect in business dealings far more difficult than this one. "Every person who works within these walls will be treated with dignity. That has been true since my father built this house, and it will remain true for as long as I have any say in how it is run. No exceptions. No matter who demands otherwise." Nora stood beside him, still trembling slightly, though now from something closer to disbelief than shame. In 6 years of service, she had never once heard anyone speak so plainly in her defense, let alone the man who owned the very house she cleaned each day. Julian turned back to her, his expression softening considerably. "Take the rest of the evening for yourself, Nora. Rest. There is nothing here that requires your hands tonight." "But sir, the dinner, the guests." "Will manage perfectly well without you carrying trays through a room where you were just treated so poorly," Julian said firmly, though not unkindly. "Please, I insist." Nora hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, murmuring a quiet thank you, and slipping away toward the servants' quarters, her steps lighter than they had been in months, though her mind remained a storm of confusion and disbelief at what had just occurred. Behind her, the hall remained tense, the air thick with the kind of silence that follows a storm no one had expected to break so suddenly indoors. Constance stood alone in the center of it, her carefully constructed image cracking in front of the very people she had hoped to impress, while Julian Ashworth stood watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, one that made her stomach twist with a fear she did not yet fully understand. She did not know it yet, but the evening that was meant to celebrate their future together had just become the moment that would unravel it entirely. For Julian, standing amid the murmuring guests and the faint smell of spilled wine, one truth had settled firmly into place, a truth he could not unknow no matter how the coming days might unfold. He had returned home expecting to build a life with a woman he barely knew. Instead, he had returned just in time to see exactly who she truly was. And somewhere down the corridor, in the quiet of the servants' quarters, Nora sat by a small window, her wrist still faintly marked, her heart still racing, wondering what on earth had just happened, and wondering, too, why the master of the house had looked at her the way he had, as though seeing her clearly for the very first time. The dinner continued that night, though the warmth it was meant to carry had drained from the room entirely. Guests spoke in hushed tones, exchanging glances whenever Constance attempted to steer conversation back toward lighter topics. Julian remained polite to his guests, gracious as always, yet the coldness in his manner toward his intended bride was impossible to miss for anyone paying attention. He answered her questions with brief, measured responses. He did not offer her his arm when they moved between rooms, a small gesture that would once have seemed automatic. By the time the last guest departed near midnight, the distance between them had grown into something neither of them could easily bridge with pleasant words alone. Long after the candles had been extinguished and the house had settled into silence, Julian remained awake in his study, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace, turning the events of the evening over and over in his mind. He thought of the years he had spent building trust with people across continents, learning to read character quickly, a skill that had served him well in business, but had apparently failed him entirely in matters of the heart. He thought of his father's voice, steady and sure, reminding him that a person's truest nature reveals itself not in grand moments, but in small ones, in the way they treat someone who can offer them nothing in return. He thought, too, of Nora, and the quiet dignity she had carried even while being humiliated in front of strangers. He had known her for years as simply part of the household, someone whose competence he had noticed only in passing, the way one notices a well-kept garden without ever asking who tends it. Tonight, for the first time, he had truly seen her, not as a fixture of the house, but as a person entirely, one who deserved far better than what she had received. He did not yet know what the coming days would bring, whether his engagement could survive what he had witnessed, or whether it even should. But one thing had become unmistakably clear as he sat alone in the quiet of his study, the fire slowly fading to embers around him. He had returned home just in time to see the truth, and now that he had seen it, there would be no unseeing it, no matter how carefully anyone tried to smooth the pieces back into place. Morning arrived at Ashworth Manor wrapped in a pale gray mist that clung to the hedgerows and softened the edges of the great stone house, as though the world itself were trying to offer a gentler beginning after the sharp edges of the night before. Nora woke earlier than usual, her body accustomed to rising before the sun regardless of what the previous evening had held. For a moment, lying in the narrow bed of the servants' quarters, she allowed herself to believe it had all been a dream, the shouting, the grip on her wrist, the master of the house kneeling beside her on the cold floor. But the faint ache in her wrist told her otherwise, a quiet reminder that everything had truly happened exactly as she remembered. She dressed quickly, smoothing her apron with hands that had steadied considerably overnight, though a nervous flutter remained in her chest at the thought of facing the household again. Would things return to how they had always been, as though nothing unusual had occurred? Or had something shifted permanently within the walls of the house she had called home for 6 years? She did not know, and the uncertainty followed her down the narrow servants' staircase toward the kitchen, where the smell of fresh bread and simmering porridge greeted her before she had even reached the bottom step. Margaret, the head housekeeper, looked up the moment Nora entered, her weathered face creasing into an expression somewhere between relief and concern. She had served the Ashworth family for over 20 years, long enough to have practically raised Julian herself during the years his own mother had been frequently unwell, and long enough to recognize immediately when something significant had shifted within the household's delicate balance. "There you are," Margaret said, setting down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the morning porridge. "I was about to send someone up to check on you. How is your wrist?" Nora glanced down at the faint mark still visible on her skin, a soft bruise beginning to bloom where Constance's fingers had gripped too tightly. "It's nothing. It doesn't hurt much anymore." "It shouldn't have happened at all," Margaret said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "In all my years in this house, I have never seen anyone treated the way you were treated last night. Not by anyone, and certainly not by someone who isn't even mistress of this house yet." She shook her head slowly, returning her attention to the stove, though her hands moved with less steadiness than usual. "The master handled it well, though. I'll give him that. His father would have been proud to see him stand up the way he did." The mention of Julian sent a small, unfamiliar warmth spreading through Nora's chest, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside, unsure of what to make of it. He was the master of the house. She was a maid who cleaned his floors and pressed his linens. Whatever kindness he had shown her the night before had simply been the natural response of a decent man witnessing cruelty, nothing more, and she reminded herself firmly of that fact as she moved to help Margaret prepare the morning trays. Across the house, in the grand east wing reserved for family and honored guests, Constance Whitmore sat before her dressing table, staring at her own reflection with an intensity that bordered on anger. She had not slept well. The events of the previous evening replayed themselves relentlessly in her mind, each recollection sharper and more humiliating than the last. She had come to Ashworth Manor prepared to secure her place as its future mistress, to charm the staff into respecting her authority and the guests into admiring her grace. Instead, she had revealed something about herself in front of everyone that she had spent years carefully hiding, a temper she usually reserved for private moments, unleashed in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most. She thought of Julian's face as he had addressed her in front of the guests, the calm coldness in his voice, so unlike the warm, accommodating tone he had used in his letters throughout their long-distance courtship. She had imagined, perhaps foolishly, that a man who spent so much time managing business across the ocean would be too preoccupied with commerce to notice the smaller details of how a household was run, too willing to overlook minor disagreements in favor of maintaining a peaceful, profitable arrangement. She had clearly misjudged him entirely. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her longtime friend and traveling companion, Vivian Hastings, entered without waiting for a response, closing the door quietly behind her. "You look dreadful," Vivian said bluntly, settling into the chair beside the dressing table. "Though I suppose that's understandable, given how spectacularly you managed to embarrass yourself last night." Constance shot her a sharp look. "I didn't ask for your opinion." "You never do, and I give it anyway, because someone has to." Vivian crossed her arms, studying her friend with the kind of familiarity that came from years of close acquaintance. "Constance, I've watched you charm rooms full of people who could see straight through you if they only looked closely enough. But last night, you didn't just lose your temper. You lost it in front of a man who clearly values his staff more than he values appearances, and that is a very dangerous mistake to make when your entire future depends on his good opinion." "I know that," Constance snapped, though the sharpness in her voice cracked slightly at the edges, revealing something closer to panic underneath. "Do you think I don't know that? I've spent months preparing for this marriage. Do you have any idea what it means for my family if this arrangement falls apart now?" Vivian's expression softened slightly, though her words remained pointed. "Then perhaps you should consider that the solution isn't finding a clever way to smooth things over with pretty words. Perhaps the solution is actually treating people with the decency you claim to have, rather than performing it only when it's convenient." Constance turned away from the mirror, unwilling to meet either her own reflection or her friend's steady gaze any longer. She had never considered herself a cruel person, not truly. She had simply grown up in a world where servants existed to serve, where their comfort and feelings had never been presented to her as something worth serious consideration. Her own mother had run their household with an iron discipline, correcting staff sharply whenever standards slipped, and Constance had absorbed that behavior as simply how things were done among families of consequence. It had never occurred to her that a man of Julian's standing might see things so differently. "I need to speak with him," she said finally, straightening her shoulders with renewed determination. "I need to explain myself properly without an audience this time." "That," Vivian said, rising from her chair, "is the first sensible thing you've said all morning." Meanwhile, in the Manor's private study, Julian sat behind his father's old writing desk. A stack of correspondence from his overseas ventures spread before him, though his attention remained scattered, unable to settle fully on the columns of figures and shipping schedules that would normally have absorbed him completely. His mind kept drifting back to the hall, to the moment he had knelt beside Nora and helped her rise, to the quiet gratitude in her eyes that had struck him far more deeply than he cared to admit. A knock at the study door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to find Edmund Carter, his oldest friend and the Manor's trusted estate manager, standing in the doorway with an expression of poorly concealed curiosity. "The whole staff is talking about it," Edmund said without preamble, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Some are saying you nearly called off the engagement right there in the hall." Julian leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "I very nearly did." Edmund raised an eyebrow, settling into the chair across from the desk with the easy familiarity of a man who had known Julian since they were boys running wild through the Manor's gardens together. "That's serious, then. I heard she grabbed the maid's wrist hard enough to leave a mark." "She did," Julian's jaw tightened at the memory. "And she shouted at her in front of half the guests I'd invited to welcome me home, over nothing more than a spilled glass of wine." "That does sound rather like the woman I met briefly before you left for your travels," Edmund said carefully. "Though I admit, I never saw her temper on such open display. She was all smiles and pleasant conversation whenever I encountered her." "That's precisely what troubles me most," Julian admitted. "If she can behave that way in front of guests, in front of me, on the very evening meant to celebrate our future together, what does that suggest about how she treats people when no one important is watching at all?" Edmund considered this for a long moment before responding. "You've built an entire career on reading people accurately, Julian. Trust your instincts here as you would in any negotiation. If something feels fundamentally wrong, it likely is." Julian nodded slowly, though the weight of the decision ahead of him pressed heavily on his shoulders. An arranged engagement was not simply a matter of personal feeling. It involved family obligations, business interests carefully woven between two prominent families, and reputations that could be damaged severely should the arrangement collapse publicly. Yet as he sat there, turning the situation over in his mind, he found himself returning again and again to a single, simple truth his father had impressed upon him since childhood. Character revealed under pressure was always more honest than character performed for an audience, and what he had witnessed the night before had been unmistakably, undeniably real. A servant appeared at the study door moments later, informing him that Miss Whitmore requested a private audience whenever it might suit him. Julian exhaled slowly, glancing toward Edmund, who offered only a knowing look before rising to take his leave. "Good luck," Edmund said simply, closing the door softly behind him. Julian sat alone for several minutes before finally rising, straightening his coat, and making his way toward the drawing room where Constance waited, uncertain of what conversation lay ahead, but certain that whatever happened next would shape the course of his future far more significantly than any business decision he had made in years abroad. The drawing room was warmer than the study, sunlight filtering through tall windows and falling in soft patches across the polished floor. Constance stood near the fireplace when Julian entered, her posture composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed the sleepless night behind her careful appearance. She turned as the door opened, offering a smile that faltered the instant she met his expression. "Thank you for seeing me," she said quietly. Julian closed the door behind him and remained near it, not moving closer, a small distance that spoke louder than any words could have. "You wanted to speak with me." "I wanted to apologize properly," Constance said, her voice steady despite the nervousness clearly running beneath it. "What happened last night was inexcusable. I let my frustration get the better of me, and I embarrassed you myself, and that poor young woman in front of your guests. I should never have raised my voice, let alone laid a hand on her." Julian listened without interrupting, studying her carefully as she spoke. There was sincerity in her words, he could hear that much, yet something about the apology felt incomplete, as though she were addressing the consequences of her actions rather than the actions themselves. "Why did you do it?" he asked simply once she had finished. "Not last night specifically. I mean, why does it happen at all? Edmund tells me he never once witnessed this side of you before I left. Was that truly the case, or did I simply never look closely enough?" Constance hesitated, her fingers tightening around each other. "I suppose I have always struggled with my temper when I feel out of control of a situation. Arriving here, trying to establish myself before you returned, wanting everything to be perfect for your homecoming, it all became overwhelming rather quickly. That does not excuse what I did. I only want you to understand where it came from." "I understand where it came from," Julian said gently, though his tone carried none of the warmth she had hoped for. "What concerns me far more is what it revealed. A person's character shows most clearly in moments of pressure, Constance, not in moments of ease. Last night, under a small amount of pressure, you gripped a young woman hard enough to leave a mark and humiliated her in front of strangers over a spilled glass of wine. I find myself wondering what might happen under greater pressure, further down the road, when there are no guests present to witness it and no one to intervene." Color drained slightly from Constance's face. "You make it sound as though I'm some kind of monster." "I don't believe that," Julian said honestly. "I believe you're a person who has never truly had to consider the feelings of those who serve you, because no one ever asked that of you before. But I cannot build a marriage, a household, an entire life around hoping that changes. I need to know it already has, or that it truly can." "Then give me the chance to show you," Constance said quickly, stepping forward. "Let me prove that last night was an aberration, not a pattern. I can be better. I want to be better." Julian studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully against everything he had witnessed and everything he now understood about the woman standing before him. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I am willing to consider that possibility, but I need you to understand something clearly, Constance. This is not a matter I intend to overlook again. If I see even the smallest hint of the same behavior toward anyone in this household, our engagement ends immediately, and I will not be persuaded otherwise by apologies or explanations, however sincere they might seem in the moment." "I understand," Constance said, relief evident in her voice, though beneath it, something colder and more calculating had already begun to stir, a quiet resentment she was careful not to let show on her face. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Constance made a visible effort to soften her manner around the staff, offering polite thanks where none had existed before, refraining from the sharp comments that had once come so easily to her. Yet Julian noticed, with growing unease, that her kindness seemed to exist only when he was present to observe it. On several occasions, he caught fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly the moment he entered a room, glimpses of a coldness in Constance's expression that vanished the instant she noticed him watching. Nora, for her part, tried to maintain her usual routine, though the atmosphere in the house had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The other staff treated her with a newfound gentleness, as though her humiliation that night had earned her a kind of quiet solidarity among them. Margaret checked on her more frequently than usual, and even the normally reserved butler, Henry, made a point of greeting her warmly each morning, small gestures that Nora appreciated more than she let herself admit. What unsettled her most, however, was the way Julian's manner toward her had changed. He greeted her by name now, asked after her well-being with a sincerity that seemed to extend well beyond simple courtesy. And once, when he found her struggling to carry a heavy crate of linens up the servants' staircase, he insisted on carrying it himself despite her protests, ignoring entirely the surprised looks of the staff who witnessed the master of the house hauling laundry through his own hallways. "You didn't need to do that, sir," Nora said, flustered, as he set the crate down at the top of the stairs. "I know," Julian replied simply, brushing dust from his sleeves. "I wanted to." She did not know what to make of moments like these, small as they were, yet they left an impression that lingered long after he had walked away, a warmth she tried repeatedly to dismiss as nothing more than ordinary kindness, though some quiet part of her suspected it might be something more. Nearly 2 weeks after the disastrous welcome dinner, Julian found himself walking the estate grounds early one morning, restless after another night of poor sleep. The mist had not yet lifted from the fields, and the world felt hushed and private in a way that suited his troubled thoughts. He rounded the corner near the old stone well, a fixture on the property since before his grandfather's time, and stopped short at the sight of Nora sitting on its low wall, a small bundle of wildflowers gathered in her lap, her face turned toward the rising sun. She startled slightly upon noticing him, rising quickly and smoothing her apron. "Forgive me, sir. I didn't think anyone would be out this early. I was gathering flowers for my mother. She's been unwell, and I thought they might bring her some comfort." "Please sit," Julian said, gesturing toward the wall. "I didn't mean to interrupt you." Nora hesitated before lowering herself back onto the stone, though she kept a respectful distance as Julian settled beside her, an unusual informality neither of them commented on directly. "Your mother is unwell?" he asked, genuine concern coloring his voice. "I hadn't heard." "She's had a weak chest for years," Nora said. "It grows worse in the colder months. My wages help pay for the doctor's visits and her medicine, though I worry it isn't always enough." Julian was quiet for a moment, taking in this new piece of information about a woman he realized he knew far less about than he should, despite 6 years of her working within his household. "Why have you never mentioned this before?" "It isn't the kind of thing one brings up with the master of the house," Nora said with a small, wry smile. "Besides, everyone has their own burdens to carry. Mine are no different from anyone else's." "I don't believe that's entirely true," Julian said softly. "Some burdens are heavier than others, and yours sound considerable for someone carrying them largely alone." Nora glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone, unsure how to respond to a kindness so unfamiliar coming from someone of his position. "You're very different than I expected, sir, if you don't mind my saying so." "How so?" "Most men in your position wouldn't trouble themselves with the worries of a maid," she said honestly. "Yet here you are, asking after my mother's health at sunrise, as though it truly matters to you." "It does matter to me," Julian said, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made Nora's chest tighten in a way she could not fully explain. "Perhaps more than I expected it to." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the mist slowly burn away beneath the strengthening sun, neither one quite ready to name the shift that had settled between them, though both felt it clearly, a warmth neither had experienced in quite the same way with anyone else. Word of the quiet morning meeting by the old stone well did not stay quiet for long. A stable hand who had been leading a horse to pasture at dawn mentioned it in passing to another servant, who mentioned it to another, until the story reached Constance's maid, Ruth, within a single afternoon. Ruth, eager to remain in her mistress's good favor, repeated every detail she had gathered, embellishing certain parts without meaning to, until Constance sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "He carried her linens up the stairs, and now he's meeting her by the well at sunrise, gathering flowers together," Constance repeated slowly, her voice dangerously calm. "Is that truly what you heard?" "That's what I was told, miss," Ruth said nervously, sensing the storm building behind her mistress's controlled expression. "I only thought you should know." Constance dismissed her with a curt wave, sitting alone afterward in her private sitting room, the fire crackling softly while resentment burned far hotter within her chest. She had spent 2 weeks performing kindness for an audience of servants she privately despised, biting back sharp words, forcing smiles she did not feel, all in the hope of salvaging an engagement worth more to her family's future than Julian could possibly understand. And in return, she had learned that her intended husband was spending his mornings in quiet conversation with a maid, treating her with a tenderness Constance had never once received from him, not in all their letters, not in any of their brief meetings before his departure overseas. The unfairness of it settled into something colder and more determined within her. If kindness would not secure her position, perhaps something else would. Over the following days, Constance began watching Nora more closely than she let anyone realize, noting the small moments that passed between her and Julian, moments most people in the household would have dismissed as simple courtesy, but which Constance recognized immediately for what they truly were. She noticed how Julian's eyes softened whenever Nora entered a room, how he found small reasons to speak with her, asking after tasks that certainly did not require his personal attention. She noticed, too, how Nora's own composure shifted subtly in his presence, a careful stillness that spoke of feelings she was working hard to suppress. It would not do. Constance had not spent months securing this engagement, only to lose it to a maid who owned nothing beyond the clothes on her back, and whatever small wages the household provided her. She began, carefully and quietly, to lay the groundwork for Nora's removal from the household entirely. It started with small things, complaints whispered to Margaret about supposed carelessness in Nora's work, minor inaccuracies exaggerated just enough to plant seeds of doubt without appearing overtly malicious. Margaret, who knew Nora's work ethic intimately after 6 years of close supervision, dismissed most of these complaints outright, though she found herself troubled by the persistence with which Constance raised them. When subtle complaints failed to achieve the desired effect, Constance grew bolder. She began deliberately creating situations designed to make Nora appear incompetent or dishonest, moving items from where Nora had left them and later claiming they had gone missing under her care, altering instructions given to her, and then expressing surprise and disappointment when tasks were not completed exactly as she now claimed to have requested. Nora, sensing something was wrong but unable to identify precisely what, grew increasingly anxious, second-guessing her own memory and judgment in ways that left her exhausted by the end of each day. She said nothing to Julian, unwilling to burden him with concerns that seemed, on the surface, like nothing more than simple misunderstandings, unwilling too to risk appearing as though she sought his favor through complaint. Matters came to a head nearly 3 weeks after Julian's return, when Constance orchestrated her most ambitious scheme yet. A valuable brooch belonging to Julian's late mother, kept carefully within a locked drawer in the family's private sitting room, disappeared one afternoon. Constance was quick to suggest, with carefully feigned reluctance, that perhaps the household staff should be questioned, that perhaps certain individuals with access to that room ought to be considered more carefully than others. The implication was unmistakable, and it fell squarely upon Nora, who had indeed dusted that very room earlier in the day as part of her regular duties. Julian called Nora to his study that evening, his expression troubled in a way that made her stomach drop the moment she entered. Constance stood near the window, her arms crossed, her expression carefully arranged into one of reluctant concern rather than open accusation. "My mother's brooch has gone missing from the sitting room," Julian said carefully, watching Nora's reaction closely. "You were in that room earlier today, dusting the furniture. Did you happen to notice anything unusual, or move anything from where it belonged?" Nora felt the blood drain from her face, understanding immediately the direction this conversation was heading. "I saw the brooch in its drawer when I dusted the cabinet, sir, but I never opened it. I have no reason to touch anything that isn't part of my duties." "Are you quite certain?" Constance interjected smoothly from her place by the window. "It would be entirely understandable if it slipped your memory. No one is accusing you of anything untoward, of course. We simply need to understand what happened." The gentle, reasonable tone of Constance's words did nothing to disguise the accusation woven carefully beneath them, and Nora understood immediately that she was being cornered, though she could not yet see precisely how or why. "I did not touch the brooch," Nora repeated firmly, her voice steady despite the fear rising within her. "I would never take anything that does not belong to me. I have worked in this house for 6 years, and no one has ever had cause to question my honesty before." "No one has ever had cause," Constance said gently, "until now, perhaps." Julian's gaze moved between the two women, his expression unreadable, though something in his careful stillness suggested he was working through the situation with far more scrutiny than either of them realized. "Nora," he said finally, "I need you to think very carefully. Was the room locked when you finished your duties there?" "Yes, sir. I locked it myself, as I always do, and returned the key to its place in the housekeeper's cabinet." "And who else had access to that key today?" Nora hesitated, unwilling to point fingers at anyone directly, though the question lingered heavily in the room. Before she could answer, Margaret, who had been summoned along with several other staff members, spoke up from where she stood near the door. "I can answer that, sir, if I may," Margaret said. "The key remained in the cabinet throughout the morning. I know this because I checked on it myself around midday out of simple habit. However, I noticed later in the afternoon that it had been moved, placed back in a slightly different position than where it normally rests. I assumed at the time that perhaps someone had simply been careless in returning it, but now I wonder if that assumption was mistaken." "Who had access to the cabinet during that window of time?" Julian asked. "Several people, sir," Margaret admitted. "Myself, Nora, and Miss Whitmore's own maid, Ruth, who I recall passing through the servants' hall around that time on an errand." A tense silence fell over the room. Constance's composure flickered almost imperceptibly, though she recovered quickly. "Surely you don't mean to suggest my own maid would involve herself in something so improper?" "I'm suggesting nothing, Miss Whitmore," Margaret said carefully, though her tone carried an unmistakable firmness. "I'm simply answering the question I was asked." Julian's attention sharpened considerably. "Bring Ruth here, please." Several tense minutes passed before Ruth arrived, visibly nervous, her hands twisting together as she stood before the small assembly. Under Julian's careful, patient questioning, her composure crumbled far more quickly than Constance's had, and within a matter of minutes, the truth began spilling out in halting, frightened admissions. Constance had asked her to move the brooch, she explained, hidden now within a small box tucked beneath Constance's own bed linens, intended to be discovered later in a manner that would cast suspicion firmly upon Nora. "I didn't want to do it, sir," Ruth said, tears streaming down her face. "But Miss Whitmore threatened to dismiss me without a reference if I refused. I have a family depending on my wages. I didn't know what else to do." The room fell utterly silent. Julian turned slowly toward Constance, whose carefully maintained composure had finally, completely shattered, leaving behind an expression of raw, cornered desperation that revealed more about her true character than any words could have. "Julian, please let me explain," Constance began, her voice trembling now with something closer to panic than grace. "I think," Julian said quietly, though his voice carried a weight that silenced the room entirely, "that you have explained quite enough already, Constance. More than enough, in fact. The brooch was recovered within the hour, found exactly where Ruth had described, tucked beneath a fold of linen at the bottom of a trunk in Constance's private quarters." Julian held it in his palm for a long moment after it was returned to him, the small, familiar weight of it a quiet reminder of his mother, who had worn it often during his childhood, who had always spoken kindly of every person who worked within these walls, regardless of their station. He thought, standing there in the hallway outside Constance's rooms, that his mother would have been ashamed to see how close her memory had come to being used as a weapon against someone innocent. He found Constance waiting in the drawing room, her earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by a brittle, defensive anger that did little to hide the fear beneath it. "I did what I felt necessary," she said before he could speak, her chin lifted in a last, desperate attempt at dignity. You were slipping away from me, Julian, spending your mornings with a maid instead of your intended bride. What was I supposed to do? Simply stand aside and watch my future disappear? You were supposed to behave with basic decency, Julian said, his voice quiet but unyielding. Instead, you threatened a frightened young woman into helping you frame an innocent person for theft, all to protect your own position in this house. That is not the behavior of someone slipping away from affection, Constance. That is the behavior of someone who never possessed the character necessary to deserve it in the first place. You're going to end things over this, Constance said, her voice cracking slightly, though whether from grief or fury, Julian could no longer tell. I ended things the moment you gripped Nora's wrist hard enough to leave a mark, Julian said honestly. Everything since then has simply been me hoping, against my better judgment, that I was wrong about what that moment revealed. I was not wrong. Constance opened her mouth to argue further, but something in Julian's expression, calm and utterly resolute, told her clearly that no words remaining to her would change the outcome now. She left Ashworth Manor 2 days later, her belongings packed hastily, her departure witnessed by a household staff who watched her carriage disappear down the long drive without a single word of farewell exchanged between them. Ruth remained, given a second chance at Julian's insistence, though she carried the weight of her involvement in the scheme with visible remorse for weeks afterward, determined to prove herself trustworthy through diligent, honest work. News of the broken engagement spread quickly through the surrounding countryside, carried along by servants, tradesmen, and the inevitable gossip that traveled faster than any letter. Julian faced questions from family friends and business associates alike, some sympathetic, others openly curious about the scandal, though he answered each inquiry with the same simple, steady explanation. He had discovered, in time, that the woman he had agreed to marry did not possess the character necessary for the life he wished to build, and he would rather face temporary scandal than a lifetime bound to someone capable of such cruelty. For Nora, the weeks following Constance's departure brought a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The immediate threat to her position had passed, her name cleared entirely through Ruth's honest confession. Yet she found herself uncertain of how to navigate the household's new atmosphere, uncertain, too, of what to make of the warmth that continued to grow between herself and the master of the house, a warmth that no longer had to hide itself behind careful excuses or brief, stolen conversations by an old stone well. Julian, for his part, made no secret of his growing affection, though he remained careful and patient, unwilling to rush Nora into anything that might make her uncomfortable given the significant difference in their stations. He began, gradually, making his intentions known through small, consistent gestures. He arranged for a proper physician from the city to visit her mother, covering the expense entirely without ever making her feel indebted for it. He ensured her workload eased considerably, insisting that Margaret assign her lighter duties that allowed her more time to rest and to visit her mother regularly. He sought her opinion on matters concerning the household, valuing her insight in ways that surprised even the older, more established staff. One late autumn afternoon, several weeks after Constance's departure, Julian found Nora once again near the old stone well, though this time she was not alone with her thoughts, but rather deep in laughter with young Edmund's daughter, who had come to visit the estate, and had taken an immediate liking to Nora's gentle patience. Julian paused at a distance, watching the scene unfold, struck once again by how naturally kindness seemed to flow from her, how effortlessly she put others at ease despite everything she herself carried. When the child ran off toward the garden, chasing a butterfly with delighted shrieks, Nora noticed Julian standing nearby and offered him a warm smile that had grown increasingly easy between them over the past weeks. "You have a gift with children," Julian observed, moving to join her by the well. "My mother always said I had more patience than sense," Nora replied with a small laugh. "Though I suppose patience serves better than sense in most situations involving small children and butterflies." They fell into comfortable conversation, as had become their habit, discussing small matters of the household, her mother's improving health, the changing colors sweeping across the estate's distant hills as autumn deepened around them. It was during a lull in their conversation, the two of them simply watching the play of sunlight across the fields, that Julian finally found the courage to speak the thoughts that had been building steadily within him for weeks. "Nora," he said carefully, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to feel entirely free to answer honestly, without any concern for how your answer might affect your position here." She turned to face him, curiosity and a flicker of nervousness crossing her features. "Of course, sir." "Please," he said gently, "call me Julian, at least when we're speaking privately like this. I think we've moved well beyond formalities by now, don't you agree?" A soft blush colored her cheeks, though she nodded. "Julian, then." "I find myself thinking of you constantly," he continued, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation he applied to his most important business negotiations, though nothing in his career had ever felt quite so significant as this moment. "Not simply as someone within my household, but as a person whose company brings me more genuine happiness than I've felt in a very long time. I understand the difference in our stations complicates things considerably, and I understand entirely if you feel unable to see past that difference. But I did not want to let another day pass without telling you plainly how I feel." Nora's heart pounded so loudly she felt certain he must be able to hear it. She had spent weeks pushing aside the feelings that had grown steadily within her, telling herself repeatedly that such feelings could lead nowhere sensible, that a maid and a landowner belonged to entirely different worlds regardless of whatever warmth might pass between them during quiet mornings by an old well. Yet hearing him speak so plainly now, so sincerely, made every careful argument she had constructed against her own feelings crumble entirely. "I've felt it too," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, though the honesty in it carried clearly across the small distance between them. "I've tried very hard not to, believe me. It seemed foolish, impossible even, to imagine anything between us given how different our circumstances are. But I cannot pretend any longer that my feelings haven't grown well beyond what would be considered proper for someone in my position." Julian reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, and took her hand gently in his own. "Then let us not concern ourselves with what would be considered proper," he said softly. "Let us simply consider what would make us both genuinely happy, and build from there." Word of Julian's growing affection for Nora reached his extended family within a matter of weeks, carried by well-meaning relatives who had heard rumors from mutual acquaintances in the countryside. His aunt, Lady Prudence Ashworth, arrived unannounced one gray morning, determined to speak sense into her nephew before, in her words, he ruined the family's standing entirely by courting a household maid. "Julian, be reasonable," she said, seated stiffly in his study, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. "I understand Constance proved unsuitable, truly I do, and I commend you for recognizing her true character before the wedding rather than after. But surely there are other suitable young women from good families who would welcome your attention. This business with the maid, whatever affection you believe you feel, cannot possibly be sustained. Think of what people will say." Julian listened respectfully, as he always did with his aunt, though his resolve remained entirely unmoved by her arguments. "Aunt Prudence, I have spent the better part of a year watching a woman perform kindness and gentility for an audience while treating those beneath her with genuine cruelty when she believed no one important was watching. I have also spent recent weeks watching a woman show consistent kindness to everyone around her, whether they can offer her anything in return or not, simply because kindness is woven into her very nature. If I must choose between an advantageous match and genuine character, I find the choice far easier than you might expect. Character does not pay for the upkeep of an estate this size," his aunt replied sharply, "nor does it satisfy the expectations of the society you belong to." "Perhaps not," Julian acknowledged calmly. "But I have more than enough wealth already to maintain this estate for several lifetimes, and I find I care considerably less about the expectations of society than I once believed I did. I would rather build a life with someone I trust completely and admire genuinely, than spend my years maintaining appearances for people whose opinions matter far less to my happiness than my own conscience does. His aunt left that afternoon unconvinced, though she departed with noticeably less certainty than she had arrived with. And within a few months, as she watched the genuine happiness radiating from her nephew whenever he spoke of Nora, her objections softened considerably, eventually giving way to a grudging, then genuine, acceptance. The wider community proved more varied in its reactions. Some among the local gentry whispered disapprovingly behind closed doors, scandalized by the notion of a landowner courting a maid so openly. Others, however, particularly those who had known Julian's parents, and remembered their own reputation for fairness and generosity toward those who served them, found themselves quietly admiring his willingness to defy convention in favor of genuine happiness. Slowly, gradually, as Nora's own gentle warmth won over even the most skeptical acquaintances she encountered, the disapproval faded into something closer to acceptance, then eventually into genuine goodwill. Nora's own mother, whose health had improved considerably under the care of the physician Julian had arranged, wept with joy when her daughter finally worked up the courage to share the news of Julian's affections. "I always knew you were meant for something more than a life of endless service, my dear," she said, gripping her daughter's hands tightly. "Not because you deserve wealth or status for their own sake, but because you deserve to be cherished by someone who truly sees your worth. It sounds as though you've finally found exactly that." Nora herself struggled at times with lingering doubts, uncertain whether she truly belonged in the world Julian occupied, worried that the vast difference in their circumstances might eventually create distance between them that affection alone could not bridge. Julian, sensing these quiet fears whenever they surfaced, addressed them patiently and consistently, never once making her feel as though her background diminished her worth in any way. "You once told me that everyone carries their own burdens," he reminded her one evening, as they walked together through the estate's gardens beneath a sky scattered with early stars. "You carried yours with more grace than most people I've ever known, working tirelessly, caring for your mother, treating everyone around you with kindness even when kindness was not returned to you in equal measure. That is not a lesser life, Nora. That is character built through genuine hardship, and it is worth infinitely more to me than any title or fortune a more conventional match might have offered." Nearly a year after Julian's fateful early return from his overseas travels, Ashworth Manor once again prepared for a grand celebration, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the tension that had marked the disastrous welcome dinner so many months before. The household staff, who had watched the entire story unfold from its earliest, most painful beginning, threw themselves into the preparations with genuine enthusiasm and affection, decorating the great hall with care that reflected not obligation but true happiness for the couple whose wedding they now celebrated. Margaret oversaw the kitchen preparations with tears of joy she made no effort to hide, having watched Nora grow from a shy young girl into the confident, beloved woman who would soon become mistress of the very house she had once cleaned. Edmund stood proudly beside Julian as his closest friend and witness, while Ruth, forever grateful for the second chance she had been given, arranged flowers throughout the hall with meticulous, heartfelt care. When Nora walked down the grand staircase on the day of the wedding, dressed simply but beautifully, her mother watching with tears streaming freely down her face, Julian felt a certainty settle within his chest that no business negotiation, no arranged engagement, no calculated match had ever provided him. He thought back, as he often did during quiet moments, to that fateful evening when he had arrived home early enough to witness Constance's cruelty firsthand, early enough to see clearly the truth of her character before it was too late to change course. Fate, or perhaps simple timing, had granted him a gift that day, though he had not recognized it fully in the moment. The chance to see clearly, to choose wisely, and ultimately, to build a life with someone whose kindness had never once wavered, whether observed by an audience or witnessed by no one at all. As the ceremony concluded, and the household gathered to celebrate long into the evening, laughter and music filling the halls that had once echoed with cruel words and quiet humiliation, Nora looked around at the life she had never dared to imagine for herself, surrounded by people who had become, in every meaningful sense, her family. She thought of that terrible night by the dining table, the shame that had burned through her as Constance's voice rang out across the hall, and she marveled quietly at how completely that painful moment had transformed into the foundation of everything good that followed. Julian found her later that evening, standing alone near the same old stone well where their quiet friendship had first begun to bloom into something deeper. He came to stand beside her, taking her hand gently in his own, exactly as he had done that first morning by the well so many months before. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, watching the moonlight play across her face. Nora smiled, leaning gently against him, the weight of years of hardship finally settled into something resembling peace. "None at all," she said. "Only gratitude that you arrived home exactly when you did, and that you chose to act with kindness rather than simply looking away." Julian pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, holding her close beneath the vast, star-scattered sky. "I have never been more grateful for good timing in my entire life," he said quietly, and together they stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the wedding celebrations glow warmly from the windows of the house they would now call home together, built not on arrangement or convenience, but on genuine respect, unwavering kindness, and a love that had proven itself, again and again, exactly when it mattered most.